They looked at your kindness and made the wrong decision. They saw your calm tone, your open heart, your patience, and they mistook all of it for weakness. They thought your softness meant you would stay no matter what. They thought your silence would always break first. They thought if they pulled away, you would chase. If they gave less, you would give more. If they stayed unclear, you would keep explaining yourself until the whole connection rested on your shoulders. And maybe for a while, that is exactly what happened. Not because you were foolish, not because you lacked value, but because you loved with honesty in a world that often rewards distance more than depth. That is what they failed to understand. Some people confuse warmth with easy access. Some people confuse loyalty with low standards. Some people see a steady heart and assume they can play with it without consequences. But stay with me, because this is where the story turns. The same person they thought they had figured out begins to change in silence. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with revenge, with clarity, with self-respect, with the kind of inner shift that does not need an announcement to become powerful. And when that shift begins, everything they believed about you starts falling apart, because the person they thought would always remain available is no longer standing in the same place. And once that happens, the whole balance changes. At first, they did not think of themselves as cruel. That would be too simple. What drove them was control. Control felt safe. Distance felt safe. Uncertainty on your side gave them comfort on theirs. If they could disappear for a while and still feel your energy waiting, they felt secure. If they could reply late and still receive your full attention, they felt protected. If they could stay emotionally half open while you kept the connection alive, they could enjoy closeness without the full weight of vulnerability. So they watched you carefully. They noticed how understanding you were. They noticed that you did not explode over every inconsistency. They noticed that you tried to see the good in them, even when their actions made no sense. And instead of treating that as something precious, they treated it as something predictable. They tested the space without always admitting to themselves that they were doing it. They delayed replies just to feel the emotional temperature. They cancelled plans and watched how much grace you would offer. They gave small pieces of affection and waited to see whether you would turn crumbs into a whole meal. And every time you answered with patience, they quietly assumed they had room to keep doing it. That was the mistake, because patience is not permission. Understanding is not surrender. Empathy is not weakness. And the people who love most deeply are often the very people who can leave most cleanly once they see the truth clearly. Remember that, because it changes everything. What they never saw was that your kindness came from awareness, not from helplessness. You noticed more than you said. You felt the tension in their body when things got too close. You saw how they changed the subject when emotions became real. You noticed how compliments made them uncomfortable, how honesty made them restless, how tenderness made them pull back just when things were becoming meaningful. And instead of punishing them for that, you met them with softness. You thought maybe they needed safety. Maybe consistency would show them that not everyone leaves. Maybe if you stayed calm, they would slowly let down the walls they had spent years building. So you gave space. You gave understanding. You tried to meet them halfway, even when they barely moved. But there comes a point when emotional maturity stops looking like endless tolerance and starts looking like truth. You began to see that loving someone should not require shrinking yourself. You began to see that clarity should not feel like a luxury. You began to see how much energy was disappearing into trying to decode mixed signals, soften your needs, and keep peace in a connection that kept asking you to carry more than your share. And here is the deeper truth. Understanding someone's pain does not mean agreeing to be wounded by it. Seeing their fear does not mean volunteering to become the place where that fear causes damage. That is where your shift started, quietly, internally, and once it began, it did not stop. For a while, the pattern gave them confidence. When they stepped back, you stepped forward. When they went quiet, you checked in. When they offered a little, you tried to build something real from almost nothing. That dynamic fed their sense of control because it allowed them to stay emotionally safer than you. They did not have to define anything because you were still there. They did not have to bring consistency because your hope kept the connection breathing. Hot and cold only works when the other person keeps translating confusion into potential. And because you cared, you kept trying. That is what caring does. It communicates, it explains, it reaches, it looks for meaning. But every cycle leaves a mark. Every unanswered effort teaches something. Every night night spent replaying conversations, every moment spent wondering whether you were asking for too much, every time you adjusted your own needs to keep the bond from slipping away, something inside you was collecting evidence. Then one day, without a dramatic scene, the pattern became visible, not just once, clearly, completely, and once you truly see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. That is the moment everything changed, not because you stopped feeling, not because you suddenly hated them, but because you got tired of disappearing inside a connection that kept asking for your depth while offering you uncertainty in return. And this is where most people miss the real power. The power was not in making them miss you, the power was in finally seeing yourself. You started pulling your energy back not as punishment, but as protection. You stopped explaining what should have been obvious. You stopped sending full paragraphs to one-line replies. You stopped trying to rescue moments that kept collapsing under the weight of uneven effort. You matched energy, not from ego, but from self-respect. You regulated yourself. You let the silence stay silent. You let the distance reveal what it was revealing. And when you did that, confusion entered their world, because the version of you they had labeled as predictable was no longer moving in the old rhythm. They were used to your reassurance. They were used to your emotional availability softening every inconsistency. They were used to your warmth being easy to access. Now suddenly, you were not reacting the same way. You were not chasing clarity from someone committed to confusion. You were not panicking when they delayed. You were not trying to close the gap every time they widened it. And that changed the emotional landscape immediately. Silence from them had once been part of the pattern. Silence from you felt different. Theirs had often been a shield. Yours became a boundary. Theirs reached for control. Yours reached for peace. And when peace enters a space built on imbalance, it exposes everything. That is why your quiet unsettled them. Not because it was cruel, because it was composed, because it carried no desperation, because for the first time, your energy was no longer revolving around their comfort. And that is the moment the leverage they thought they had began to slip. You did not become cold. You became centered. There is a difference, and it matters. You started putting your warmth back into your own life, into your mornings, into your routines, into your work, your sleep, your body, your peace. You invested in parts of yourself that had been waiting for your full attention while you were busy trying to keep a difficult connection alive. And the more grounded you became, the less readable you seemed to them. People who depend on control often feel secure when they can predict your emotional response. When that predictability disappears, they start paying attention in a new way. They check their phone more often. They replay the last conversation. They wonder why you have not reached back. They feel the absence of your effort more than they expected, because what they had called your availability was actually one of the things regulating their own emotions. Your steadiness had become part of their environment, even if they never admitted it. And when that steady presence stopped buffering the tension had somewhere else to go, back to them. This is the part many people never say clearly enough, so hear it now. You did not create their discomfort. You stopped carrying it for them. You stopped absorbing the confusion, smoothing the rough edges, and translating inconsistency into hope. That is not manipulation. That is maturity. That is what happens when someone finally decides that love should not cost them their center. And once you feel that kind of self-respect moving through your body, it becomes very hard to go back to begging for what should be given freely. Then the psychological reversal begins. Slowly, quietly. At first, it may not look like much. A view on your story, a delayed like, a casual message that acts as if no distance ever happened, a light check-in with heavy meaning underneath it. Hey, how have you been? Simple words, neutral tone, but behind that message is a question they may never say out loud. Are you still reachable? Do I still matter there? Is the door still open the way it used to be? Because now they are the ones sitting with uncertainty. They are the ones wondering what changed. They are the ones trying to read your tone. And the irony is sharp. They once believed they understood your emotional pattern. Now they are studying your restraint. They once felt safe because your care seemed guaranteed. Now your peace has made your presence feel earned instead of automatic. That shift creates respect, even when it stays unspoken. Not every person will admit it. Not every person will respond with growth. Some will pull back further. Some will hide behind ego. Some will tell themselves they never cared that much, simply because facing the truth feels too exposing. But the respect still forms, quietly, reluctantly, because there is something humbling about realizing the person you thought you could keep waiting has learned how to walk away without hate, without chaos, without collapse. And if you have ever doubted the force of grounded silence, this is your reminder. Calm boundaries say more than emotional speeches ever could. Still, this is the point where you have to stay awake, because their return, their curiosity, their renewed attention does not automatically mean transformation. Sometimes people come back because they miss you. Sometimes they come back because they feel the loss. Sometimes they come back because your absence forced them to see what your presence had been giving them. But sometimes they come back because they are uncomfortable losing access. Sometimes it is attachment. Sometimes it is ego. Sometimes it is fear of no longer being able to reach what once felt guaranteed. That is why your growth matters now more than ever. Before, you may have rushed to reconnect. Before, a small sign might have been enough to pull you fully back in. Now you pause. Now you observe. Now you ask better questions. Is there consistency? Is there accountability? Is there actual effort, or just a brief spark of attention because the old pattern no longer works? This is where discernment becomes your protection. Real change is not intense for 2 days and distant for 2 weeks. Real change is not a sudden flood of words with no different behavior behind them. Real change is steady. It is clear. It takes responsibility. It meets you halfway without needing to be pulled there. Anything less may feel exciting, but excitement is not the same as safety. And if you have learned anything from this whole experience, let it be this: temporary intensity can still be another form of avoidance if it disappears the moment true vulnerability is required. There is also something deeper happening inside them, whether they show it or not. Your distance may have revealed feelings they had minimized. Many people who protect themselves through detachment like to believe they are less affected than they truly are. They take pride in independence. They rely on distance to feel strong. But attachment does not vanish just because it is unspoken. It waits under the surface. It sits quietly until access is threatened. And when your warmth is no longer easy to reach, they may begin to feel emotions they had successfully pushed aside for a long time. Not loud emotions, not dramatic ones, quiet ones, restless ones, questions that arrive late at night, thoughts that return when the room is still. Did I push too far? Did I misread them? Was I safer than I was honest? Did I lose something real because I only knew how to control it instead of meet it? These are not easy questions for someone who built their emotional identity around distance. To face them means facing vulnerability, and vulnerability has always felt dangerous to them, so they may hover instead. They may test the waters. They may send signals without clarity. They may move close and then hesitate again. That is why your grounding matters so much, because mixed signals can still wake old hope. A little warmth can still stir old longing. But now you know the difference between genuine effort and reactive pursuit. One is rooted in courage, the other is rooted in fear of loss, and your peace depends on seeing that difference clearly. The strongest part of your shift is not that they notice it. The strongest part is that you notice it. You feel the difference in your nervous system. You are no longer waiting all day for a reply to decide whether the evening feels heavy or light. You are no longer reshaping your mood around someone else's inconsistency. You are no longer speaking from panic, proving from fear, or loving from a place of depletion. You have felt what it is like to return to yourself, and that experience changes a person permanently. Once you know what grounded love feels like inside your own body, chaos loses some of its charm. Once you feel peace that does not depend on another person finally choosing you correctly, old patterns start looking far less romantic. You begin to understand that balance is not boring, stability is not empty, reciprocity is not too much to ask. In fact, it is the minimum needed for something real to grow. This is where your standards stop being ideas and start becoming lived decisions. You no longer explain your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. You no longer hand out endless access in the name of being understanding. You no longer confuse emotional availability with obligation, and this does not make you hard. It makes you honest. It makes you wise. It makes your love cleaner, stronger, and far more protected than before. If someone enters your life now, they enter a different version of you. Not a bitter version, not a guarded wall, a clearer person, a steadier heart, a soul that still loves deeply, but no longer at the price of self-abandonment. What unsettles them most is not anger, it is dignity. Anger they could have defended against, drama they could have dismissed. A dramatic ending would have made it easier for them to keep their old story about you. They could have called you emotional, they could have called you intense, they could have used your pain to justify their distance. But your composure took that story away from them. You did not collapse, you did not retaliate, you did not chase them through every door they closed. You simply changed your participation, and that is much harder to argue with. Dignity lingers, it reshapes memory, it leaves a different kind of mark. When someone looks back and realizes the person they underestimated was never actually weak, only patient, something shifts in how they see the entire connection. They begin to understand that your softness was not fragility, it was restraint. Your openness was not desperation, it was courage. Your willingness to understand them was not proof that you would accept anything, it was proof that you could love with intelligence as well as heart. And when that love steps back, it carries weight, not because it is trying to hurt, but because it stops making excuses for what it sees clearly. So if part of you still wonders whether being underestimated means there was something small about you, let that thought go. Being misread is not proof of weakness. Sometimes it is simply what happens when deep people meet shallow assumptions. Sometimes the quietest strength takes the longest to be recognized, and by the time it is recognized, it has already moved. Not everyone will rise to meet your new standard. That is important to accept. Some people will respect your strength and still remain too afraid to grow. Some will admire your composure from a distance, but never develop the emotional courage needed to stand beside it. Some will miss you and still choose familiar avoidance over honest effort. That is not your failure. It is not evidence that you asked for too much. It is evidence of their current capacity. Growth sounds beautiful until it demands accountability. Healing sounds attractive until it asks someone to face the very defenses they have used for years to survive. So yes, they may feel your value more deeply now. Yes, they may understand you differently. Yes, they may even regret how they handled you. But regret and readiness are not the same thing. Missing you and meeting you are not the same thing. Respecting your strength and matching it are not the same thing. This is why your peace cannot be built on what they finally realize. Their realization may come, it may not. Their effort may grow, it may not. But your transformation remains either way. That is the real outcome. The real victory is not that they are now confused by your silence. The real victory is that your silence is no longer filled with fear. It is filled with self-trust. It is filled with alignment. It is filled with the quiet knowledge that your depth deserves depth in return, not just fascination from a distance. And once you fully know that, life becomes simpler, not easier, simpler, because what is not mutual stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling clear. So if they do return, if they do reach again, if they do begin circling back with softer eyes and a different tone, let your wisdom lead instead of your old ache. Listen, but do not rush. Feel, but do not abandon yourself. Watch the pattern, not just the moment. Real intention can stand the test of time. Real care does not need confusion to survive. Real connection can handle clarity. If their presence brings peace, consistency, accountability, and honest effort, then let reality show that over time. But if their return is only driven by the discomfort of losing access, your discernment will feel it. You will notice the difference now, because you are no longer operating from hunger alone. You are operating from awareness, and awareness is powerful. It keeps your heart open without leaving it unguarded. It lets you love without losing your center. It lets you remain compassionate without becoming available for harm. That is the new energy. That is the new shape of your strength. You were never easy to play. You were simply real in a space where many people were used to masks, half-truths, and controlled distance. They mistook your sincerity for simplicity. They mistook your patience for permanent access. They mistook your empathy for weakness. And when you quietly corrected that misunderstanding with your actions, the whole dynamic changed. Let that sink in, not because this is the end, but because it may be the first time you truly see what your growth has done. You did not lose yourself, you found yourself, and once that happens, nothing feels the same again.